Good morning, St. Catherine's. It's a privilege and a joy to be with you here today. I've gotten to know some of you before from diocesan things or school things. For those that I haven't got to know, I'm Ryan Curry. I serve on Bishop Ruth's staff as her canon for common mission. I'm still figuring out what that is, still learning a lot about this new ministry. But one thing that I figured out pretty early on is that compared to when I was a parish priest, I don't preach near as much as I used to, and I miss it. I mentioned this recently to my mother, who is herself a preacher's kid. She knows the biz. And she said this: "I can imagine that. You must hardly ever get to hear yourself talk anymore." So it's good to have friends, or better yet, relatives, to keep you in check. All that is to say, I'm excited to be here and thank you for your warm welcome. My mother and I had this exchange last week when I was visiting her and my other family members in my hometown of Mobile, Alabama. And it had been a long time since I spent much time there. So I was driving around and showing my husband Richard some of the old haunts. We happened to drive by my old high school. Murphy High is not a fancy place. It's a large public school. It was around 3,200 students when I graduated. Diverse in terms of race, class background, geography. In one of the older parts of town, its district is really kind of a watershed. Everyone who doesn't attempt to go somewhere else eventually sort of trickles down to Murphy. So it wasn't a fancy place, but it did have a few fancy things about it, including the International Baccalaureate Program, IB. Some of you are probably aware of it. I saw a few nods. It's an elite high school diploma administered by a multinational agency headquartered in Switzerland. And it was originally devised as a way for children of diplomats, military personnel who might move from continent to continent, and yet they still needed a consistent and consistently high quality education. I don't remember any children of diplomats at Murphy High School, but IB was seen as the very best preparatory program for sending students to good colleges. So I was pretty much forced to do it by my parents. And seeing those Swanee faces in the room, I can say it worked out for me. So I'm grateful in retrospect. In the 11th grade, every student in the IB program had to take a required course called Theory of Knowledge. I know, right? Sounds very serious. To whatever person in Switzerland who came up with it, it probably was a very serious course, Theory of Knowledge. I'm now twice the age I was when I took that class, and I can look back on it and safely say they should have just called it Pretending to Have Knowledge, because that's what we did. We read crazy stuff and pretended to understand it. So I do remember one unit on the philosophy of ancient Greece. We read a little bit of Plato, a little bit of Aristotle, some Athenian tragedies. And I still remember one thing that we learned, a concept called dramatic irony. Y'all remember this from your literature classes? According to the dictionary definition, in the theater, dramatic irony is when the meaning of a situation is understood by the audience, but not by the characters in the play. So, for example, you and I are sitting on your front porch, eating ice cream. You know, and I know that just about an hour ago, the city came by and touched that old bench up across the way with a nice new fresh coat of paint. But Mr. McGillicuddy, your meanest, nastiest, grumpiest neighbor, he doesn't know that. So here he comes. Who should we see come walking down the street, absent-mindedly grumbling to himself, taking a seat on that nice, fresh coat of paint. Rocky Road never tasted so sweet. But dramatic irony isn't always funny. I'm thinking of an example that I believe is important in this morning's gospel lesson. You are the salt of the earth, Jesus says. You are the light of the world. This passage is really one of the climaxes of Jesus's preaching. This follows immediately after the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are you even when you are persecuted. It's as if Jesus is heaping blessings on the crowd gathered around him for this sermon, the Sermon on the Mount. Blessing after blessing, compliment after compliment. You are the salt of the earth. That's you in the singular, by the way. I think sometimes we hear that and think a group of disciples, the church, something like that. That's you in the singular, not y'all. You yourself are the light of the world. Now you know, and I know, and I'm pretty sure actually that at a certain level, Jesus knows that this same crowd that he's heaping blessing after blessing on is the same crowd that one day will turn on him, will arrest him, will put him on trial, will mock him as he is executed. It's not a funny example of dramatic irony, but it is important because it reveals something to us about who God is. Something that goes deeper than knowledge or theories or Greek philosophy. When I came to you, brothers and sisters, wrote Paul to the Corinthians, when I came to you, I did not come proclaiming the mystery of God to you in lofty words or wisdom. For I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. What is this knowledge? This knowledge confined to the experience of Jesus Christ and him crucified. Can anyone here claim that knowledge? Can anyone here claim that experience or explain it? The pious answer is, of course, no. And yet I can't forget that I'm here preaching among a group of the faithful, among a group of Christians who were and are willing to worship wherever they could, even in an old shoe store, so long as you held to what you knew was right. Your church has been through its own experience of suffering. You have carried your cross, and so in a way, it's different, but in a way, you know this. And this ultimately is the point. This is the point. It's what Paul was telling the Corinthians when he wrote, "We have the mind of Christ." It's what he described as the wisdom of God, not human wisdom. The wisdom of God, secret and hidden. It's what Jesus tells those listeners, even the ones who would betray him. You are the salt. You are the light. There is something shining in you because you share in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Because you share in his baptism and in his supper. Because you share in reading his word and share in his spirit. And if we share in him, it goes both ways. You share in Jesus, in God, and God shares in you. God shares in your days and in your nights, in your meals, in your work, your joys, and your sufferings. This is what it means to be, in Paul's terms, spiritual. Notice he didn't say moral, he didn't say good, he said spiritual. It's not so much about how good you are or about how much you pray or meditate or whatever, or about how much you give to your church or volunteer. The spiritual life is about how intimate you are with God, how willing you are to share of yourself with God. I mean, God, after all, has seen it all. He knows it. I mean, he's seen it. He knows it, good and bad. God, in the person of Jesus Christ, stared down that crowd, that same crowd that would turn on him, no different than the crowd who would cause his death, and say, you are blessed, you are salt, you are light. Not you collectively, you yourself. Not your church, not your family, not your country, not your parents or your boss or your kids, you. I was listening to a podcast on the way back from Mobile, a podcast with a theologian named Jordan Daniel Wood, who's a fairly young guy in the Roman Catholic Church, and he's made this book out of his PhD dissertation on an ancient church father, Maximus the Confessor, sort of like, a Greek philosopher squared or something. And this guy, Jordan Daniel Wood, this theologian on the podcast, he talks about some pretty wild stuff. It's Greek philosophy and then some. There's Platonism, there's Neoplatonism. He talks about Aristotle. He talks about grace and free will and time. He even talks about time travel. So he's got a whole theory, right? He's got this whole theory of the knowledge of God as we come to know him through Jesus Christ. Because that's his job. He's a theologian. That's what he does. But do you know where he landed at the end of the interview? You could tell that he himself was moved as he said it. The interviewer asked him basically, where does the rubber meet the road with this stuff? What does it mean for the everyday Christian? And Jordan said, ultimately, it comes down to this. Somehow, God gains something in you. God gains something in you. That's the message I want you to take home today, because I think it's true. I think it's what our lessons are getting at today. Somehow, God is better off because you exist. You don't have to know it all or understand it all or have a grand theory to tie it all together. Simply because you are, and because you are God's intimately, God is better off, and you are too.